Lyra stood at the edge of the crystal platform and watched the endless darkness of space stretch before her. The twin dragons, Storm and Ash, moved quietly beside her, their scaled bodies reflecting the faint light from the distant stars. She could feel their worry through the bond they shared, that invisible connection that linked all dragons to their riders since the moment of birth. The world they inhabited was dying slowly. Verdania, the ancient home of the elves, had been a place of magic and wonder for thousands of years, but now only memories remained. The Car Syndicate had destroyed most of the great cities, burned the ancient forests, and hunted her people across the galaxy like animals. Lyra was young by elf standards, only 230 years old, but she had already lost more than most creatures could imagine. Her mother was gone, killed in the first attack on their home world. Her father had led a group of survivors to the hidden colonies scattered throughout the star systems, but he had died 3 years ago from an illness that no elf medicine could cure. Lyra had inherited his position as leader of this particular colony, even though she had never wanted power. All she wanted was to keep her people alive. Storm moved closer and pressed her massive head against Lyra's shoulder. The dragon was enormous, with scales that shimmered between silver and deep emerald green. Her wings were powerful enough to create wind that could knock an armored soldier backward. Ash circled overhead, his smaller frame moving with grace through the artificial atmosphere of their hidden station. His scales were midnight blue, almost black, and his temperament matched his appearance. Where Storm was calm and thoughtful, Ash was quick and fierce. The command center around them hummed with quiet activity. Elves worked at various stations, monitoring the position of Syndicate ships, checking the status of their supplies, and maintaining the shields that kept their colony hidden from enemy sensors. It was exhausting work, and everyone knew that their safety was only temporary. The Syndicate would find them eventually. It was only a matter of time. Lyra moved to the main viewing screen and studied the star maps that floated in the air before her. Red dots represented Syndicate vessels. There were 17 of them moving through this sector of space. Blue dots showed the positions of the few elven ships that still flew. The situation was not good. The humans liked to call it desperate. Lyra simply called it reality. A younger elf named Catherine approached her carefully. Catherine had been with Lyra since childhood, and they had survived many things together. She was now Lyra's primary advisor, and one of the few beings who could speak to her with complete honesty, without worrying about rank or position. Catherine placed a data tablet in Lyra's hands. The information on the screen showed reports from their scouts. The Syndicate was moving faster than they had before. They were heading toward the Verdania Prime Station, where 2,000 elves were currently sheltering. If the Syndicate found that location, everyone there would be killed. Lyra felt the weight of that knowledge settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the Syndicate fleet reached the coordinates. 2 weeks to do something that would either save her people or doom them forever. The pressure was almost unbearable. She turned away from the screen and looked at Catherine. The younger elf woman had fear in her eyes, but she was standing tall. This was the kind of strength that Lyra saw in all of her people. They were afraid, yes, but they refused to break. They refused to give up. Lyra made a decision in that moment. A decision that would change everything. She had always been taught that humans were unreliable and chaotic. The ancient texts said that humans lived such short lives that they could never think strategically about anything beyond their immediate survival. They were driven by emotions rather than logic, by quick anger rather than careful planning. The text said that humans had destroyed their own worlds multiple times and could never be trusted with anything important. But Lyra had been thinking about this for weeks now. The humans she had encountered in the past were nothing like the descriptions in the old books. Some of them were skilled traders who understood complex negotiations. Others had shown themselves to be honorable, even when it would have been easier to betray agreements. And most importantly, the humans had something that the elves no longer possessed. The humans had hope. For months, Lyra had been secretly communicating with a human named Margaret through encrypted channels. Margaret was the captain of a small fleet, 12 ships in total, that moved between different worlds buying and selling goods. She was intelligent and direct, and she had never treated Lyra with the dismissive attitude that most species showed toward both elves and dragons. 2 days ago, Margaret had sent a message. She wanted to meet in person. She had an idea about how the elves and humans could work together against the syndicate. It was a wild idea, probably dangerous and most certainly against all the traditions of Lyra's people, but it was also possibly the only chance they had. The meeting was planned for tomorrow in a neutral location. Lyra would take Storm and Ash with her. She would hear what Margaret had to say, and then she would make the most important decision of her life. Lyra told Catherine about the plan as they walked through the corridors of the hidden station. The younger elf listened carefully, her expression growing more concerned with every word. When Lyra finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Catherine spoke. She said that the council would never approve such a meeting. The elders would call it foolish to trust humans with sensitive information about their location and their situation. There would be arguments and debates that would last for weeks. And they did not have weeks. Lyra knew this was true. She had always followed the rules, always respected the authority of the elders, always done things the proper way. But the proper way was not working. The proper way was slowly destroying them. So she told Catherine that they would not ask permission. They would simply go. Lyra would take the dragons and fly to the meeting location. She would hear Margaret's proposal, and then she would decide what to do. Catherine looked worried, but she agreed to help. She would prepare a small ship and make sure that no one noticed their departure until they were already gone. By the time the council realized what had happened, Lyra would already know whether this wild plan might actually work. That night, Lyra could not sleep. She lay in her quarters and felt Storm and Ash resting nearby, their breathing steady and calm. The dragons did not worry the way elves did. They trusted in their bond with Lyra, and they were confident that whatever came next would be something they could face together. She thought about her mother, about her father, about all the elves who had died in the war against the syndicate. She thought about the 2,000 elves sheltering in the Prime Station, not knowing that their time was running out. She thought about what it meant to be a leader when the only choices available were all bad ones. And she thought about Margaret and the humans, and what they might offer that could change everything. The next morning, Lyra walked with Catherine to the small ship that waited in the hidden hangar. Storm and Ash followed silently, their scales gleaming in the artificial light. Lyra looked back at the station one more time, at the place where her people had tried so hard to survive, at the home she had built from nothing after her father died. She did not know if she would come back to this place. She did not know if this meeting with Margaret would lead to salvation or destruction. She only knew that she had to try. The ship lifted off from the hangar, and soon they were flying through the darkness of space toward a meeting that would either give her people a chance to fight back or confirm that they were truly and finally alone. Lyra sat in the pilot's seat with her hands on the controls, and Storm and Ash stood behind her, their presence steady and strong. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That was enough. The meeting location was a barren asteroid floating in the middle of empty space. There was nothing remarkable about it. Nothing that would attract attention from passing ships or curious patrols. This was exactly why Margaret had chosen it. Margaret understood that sometimes the safest place to hide was somewhere so unremarkable that no one would bother to look twice. Lyra landed her ship inside a natural cave formation on the asteroid's surface. The cave was large enough to conceal the vessel, and the rock walls would block sensor scans from any passing ships. She took a deep breath before disembarking, with Storm and Ash following close behind her. Walking through the cave toward the entrance, Lyra felt her heart beating faster than normal. She had never done anything like this before. All her life she had followed the rules and the traditions of her people. She had respected the authority of the elders and accepted their wisdom without question. But those traditions and that authority had not saved her people from the syndicate. If anything, they had made things worse by encouraging caution when boldness was needed. Margaret was waiting at the cave entrance with 3 of her human crew members. The human woman was tall for her species, with dark skin and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She wore practical clothing designed for space travel, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced danger many times before. When Margaret saw Lyra and the dragons, a broad smile crossed her face. It was a genuine smile, not the kind of dismissive expression that most species gave when they encountered elves or dragons. Margaret reached out her hand in the human greeting and Lyra took it. The human's grip was firm and warm. Margaret introduced her crew members. There was a man named David who was her engineer, a woman named Patricia who handled communications, and a younger man named Trevor who managed their cargo operations. They all greeted Lyra respectfully, showing none of the prejudice that she might have expected from humans. This was surprising and encouraging. They moved into a larger chamber within the asteroid where Margaret had set up a portable conference area. Chairs and a holographic display system had been installed to create a comfortable meeting space. Margaret offered refreshments, which Lyra declined politely. She was too nervous to eat or drink anything. Margaret began to speak, and her words were direct and clear. She said that she had been tracking the movements of the Syndicate for months now. Her information suggested that the Syndicate was systematically hunting down every remaining group of elves in this sector of space. She knew about the hidden colonies because her network of traders and scouts was extensive. She had been waiting for the right moment to approach Lyra because she believed that an alliance between humans and elves could change the situation. Lyra listened carefully as Margaret explained her analysis of the Syndicate's strategy and resources. The human captain showed impressive knowledge of military tactics and logistical planning. She was not just a trader, Lyra realized. Margaret was a strategic thinker who understood warfare and conflict at a deep level. Margaret then revealed her proposal. She had 12 ships with crews numbering about 400 people in total. These were not military vessels, but they could be modified for combat. More importantly, she had access to supply networks, safe houses, and information sources scattered across multiple star systems. If humans and elves worked together, they could strike against the Syndicate in ways that the enemy would not anticipate. But more than that, Margaret said something that Lyra had never heard a human say before. Margaret said that humans and elves had more in common than most people realized. Both species had faced extinction-level threats before. Both species had survived by being adaptable and creative. Both species had learned that different groups could work together when they had a common purpose. Lyra asked the question that had been in her mind for months. She asked if Margaret really believed that humans and elves could cooperate effectively, or if this was simply a business opportunity for her. Margaret's answer was important. She said that she had lost friends and family to the Syndicate's aggression. She said that the Syndicate believed that stronger species had the right to dominate weaker ones. She said that if they did not stand together against this philosophy, then neither humans nor elves would have any hope of survival in the long term. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She asked about Storm and Ash. Lyra found herself explaining the bond between dragons and their riders. She described how the dragons were not merely animals but conscious beings with intelligence and emotions. She explained that Storm and Ash could sense her thoughts and feelings, and she could sense theirs. When they flew together, it was not a simple partnership but a true blending of minds and spirits. Margaret listened intently, and when Lyra finished, the human captain asked if the dragons could understand what was being discussed. Lyra said that they could in a limited way. Dragons experienced the world differently than elves or humans did, but they understood concepts like danger and loyalty and the need to protect their people. Margaret then spoke directly to the dragons, which was unusual and somewhat amusing. She told Storm and Ash that she respected them, and that she hoped they could become allies in the fight against the Syndicate. Lyra translated the words into the emotional and sensory language that dragons understood. To her surprise, both Storm and Ash seemed to accept Margaret's greeting. They did not show any signs of fear or hostility. After several hours of discussion, Margaret brought out detailed plans for a coordinated operation. She had identified a Syndicate supply depot that was relatively lightly defended. If they could hit this depot with a coordinated attack using both human ships and the dragons, it would be a significant blow against the Syndicate's ability to resupply their fleets in this sector. The operation was risky, Margaret admitted. There was a possibility that it could fail, and if it failed, the Syndicate would know that humans and elves were working together. This knowledge would make both species targets for accelerated hunting, but the potential reward was enormous. If the attack succeeded, it would show the Syndicate that they could be hurt, that they were vulnerable, that their supposed invincibility was a myth. It would give hope to every surviving elf and human in the region. It would demonstrate to other species that resistance was possible. Lyra stood and walked to the holographic display, studying the plans for the operation. She saw Margaret's intelligence and competence reflected in every detail. The human woman had done her homework thoroughly. She understood the syndicate's habits, their defensive patterns, their supply routes. Lyra turned back to Margaret and asked a direct question. She asked what would happen if the elves won this war. She asked if the humans would turn on them once the syndicate was defeated. History suggested that stronger species often betrayed weaker ones after achieving victory together. Margaret's answer was honest. She said that she could not guarantee the future. She said that after any great war, there would be difficult decisions to make and many voices calling for different courses of action. But she said that the alternative to cooperation was certain destruction for both species. At least with cooperation they had a chance. It was not a promise, Lyra thought. It was not a guarantee of safety or prosperity. But it was a chance, and that was more than they had possessed an hour ago. Lyra told Margaret that she would present this proposal to the council. She would not make this decision alone, even though part of her wanted to. The elves deserved to have a voice in their own fate. Margaret nodded and said that she would wait for Lyra's response. She gave the elf woman a communication device, encrypted and secure, that they could use to stay in contact. Before Lyra left, Margaret asked one more question. She asked if Lyra believed that humans and elves could truly work together as partners. Lyra looked at Storm and Ash, at Margaret and her crew, at the holographic display showing their shared enemy. She said that she did not know if they could, but she believed that they had to try. She believed that her people had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. With those words, Lyra walked back through the cave toward her ship, with Storm and Ash following behind her. As she flew away from the asteroid, she knew that everything had changed. The question now was whether her people would have the courage to change along with it. The council meeting took place in the great chamber of the hidden station. The room was illuminated by glowing crystals that had been mined from the asteroid where the station was built. 12 elders sat in a semicircle, representatives from different colonies and different regions of the surviving elven population. Lyra stood before them with Catherine at her side, preparing to present information that would change everything. The head of the council was an ancient elf named Victoria. She was over 800 years old and her hair had turned completely white with age. Victoria had been a warrior in her younger days, and she still carried the bearing of someone who had seen great battles and survived incredible hardships. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. Victoria asked Lyra to explain where she had been the previous day. The council had noticed her absence, and they wanted to know the reason. Lyra took a deep breath and began to speak. She told them about her meeting with Margaret and the human captain's proposal for cooperation against the syndicate. She detailed Margaret's analysis of the military situation, explaining how the humans believed that a coordinated attack on the syndicate supply depot could change the balance of power in this sector. The reaction from the council was immediate and divided. Some of the elders began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in the ancient chamber. Some were angry that Lyra had met with humans without permission. Others were interested in what Margaret had proposed, but skeptical about the possibility of genuine cooperation with another species. Victoria raised her hand, and the chamber fell silent. The elder council leader asked Lyra directly if she believed this proposal had merit. She asked if Lyra honestly thought that humans could be trusted as partners in war. Lyra answered carefully. She said that she did not know for certain if the humans could be trusted. But she said that the alternative was to do nothing, which would certainly lead to the destruction of her people. She said that sometimes the only meaningful choice was to take a risk and hope that it would lead to survival. Another elder, a warrior named Jennifer, stood up. Jennifer had fought against the syndicate many times and she had scars across her body from past battles. She asked if Lyra understood how dangerous this was. She said that if the humans betrayed them, the syndicate would know exactly where to find them. Lyra acknowledged this. She said that Jennifer was correct, that the risk was real and significant, but she pointed out that the syndicate would find them eventually anyway. At least with Margaret's plan, they would have a chance to strike back before they were discovered. They would have a chance to hurt their enemy instead of just being hunted passively. An older elf named Brenda, who managed their supplies and resources, asked practical questions. She wanted to know what resources the operation would require, how many elves would be needed to participate, and whether Margaret had provided any guarantees about support. Lyra answered each question carefully, explaining what Margaret had told her about logistics and strategy. She admitted that there were many details that still needed to be worked out. She said that this was not a complete plan but a beginning, the foundation for a larger alliance that could protect both species. Catherine spoke up, defending her leader. Catherine said that she had known Lyra since childhood, and she had never known her to make hasty or foolish decisions. Catherine said that if Lyra believed this proposal was worth considering, then the council should take that recommendation seriously. Victoria listened to everyone's opinions before speaking. The ancient elf leader said that she understood the appeal of fighting back, of taking action instead of simply waiting for destruction. But she warned that there were reasons that elves and humans had not formed alliances in the past. She said that different species had different values and different priorities, which often led to conflict and betrayal. Victoria then asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. She asked if Lyra was willing to stake the lives of 2,000 elves at the Prime Station on her belief that humans could be trusted. The chamber fell silent. This was the real question, the one that could not be answered with strategy or analysis. This was a question of faith and judgment and personal conviction. Lyra walked forward and stood directly before Victoria. She said that she was indeed willing to stake those lives on this alliance. She said that she would place herself at the greatest risk by being the visible symbol of the partnership. She said that she and her dragons would be the first targets if the humans betrayed them, so she had as much to lose as anyone. Victoria studied Lyra's face for a long moment. The ancient elf seemed to be looking into the younger woman's soul, trying to measure her courage and her wisdom and her capacity for leadership. Finally, Victoria spoke. She said that she had made many decisions in her long life, and most of them had seemed right at the time only to be proven foolish years later. She said that this decision was similar. She could not guarantee that it was right, but she believed that Lyra was sincere in her conviction, and that sincerity had value. Victoria called for a vote. She asked the council members to decide whether they would support a trial alliance with the humans for the purpose of conducting a single coordinated operation against the syndicate. If the operation succeeded, they could consider expanding the partnership. If it failed, they would retreat to their hidden colonies and resume their defensive posture. The vote was close. 7 elders supported the proposal, while 5 opposed it. It was not a unanimous decision, but it was enough. The council gave Lyra permission to formalize an alliance with Margaret, and to begin planning the coordinated attack on the syndicate supply depot. Lyra felt relief wash over her, but it was mixed with the weight of responsibility. The decision was made. Now she had to make sure it succeeded. Over the next 2 weeks, Lyra worked constantly with Margaret and her human crews to plan the operation. She learned more about human military strategy and tactics. She discovered that while humans and elves thought differently, they could find common ground when they focused on shared objectives. Lyra brought Storm and Ash to meet Margaret's crews. At first, the humans were nervous around the dragons, but the animals quickly became comfortable with the new people. Storm seemed to enjoy the attention from the human crew members, while Ash developed a particular fondness for a human engineer named David, who regularly brought the dragon treats that he had discovered the dragon species enjoyed. The night before the operation was scheduled to begin, Lyra stood on the observation platform of the human flagship with Storm and Ash at her side. Margaret joined her, and the 2 women stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars. Margaret said that she hoped this was the beginning of something better. She said that she believed that humans and elves, working together with purpose and honesty, could accomplish things that neither species could achieve alone. Lyra looked at her new ally and felt something that had been absent from her life for a very long time. She felt hope. Real, genuine hope that the future might hold something more than just despair and destruction. Tomorrow they would attack the syndicate. Tomorrow the alliance between humans and elves would face its first real test. But tonight, standing under the stars with the 2 beings she loved most in the universe, Lyra allowed herself to believe that victory was possible. The syndicate supply depot was a massive structure built into the side of a moon orbiting a dead planet. The installation contained weapons, ammunition, spare parts for ships, and provisions to support the syndicate fleet operations in this region for several months. From a military standpoint, it was a valuable target. From a symbolic standpoint, it was even more important. Destroying the depot would prove to the syndicate that they could be hurt. Lyra flew toward the moon in her small fighter craft, with Storm and Ash positioned beside her in their natural flying formation. Behind them came 12 human ships, arranged in a defensive pattern that Margaret had designed, specifically to maximize their firepower while minimizing their exposure to enemy weapons. The human communication channel crackled with activity as different crew members reported their status. Everyone was nervous, but the training and preparation had instilled a sense of competence and professionalism. When Margaret gave the order to proceed toward the target, every ship moved exactly where it was supposed to be. The Syndicate defenders reacted quickly, but they were unprepared for what they were facing. The combination of human ship tactics and dragon aerial assault was unlike anything they had encountered before. Storm and Ash attacked the defensive installations with precision and fury, their dragon fire destroying weapons emplacements and forcing enemy soldiers to scatter. The human ships opened fire simultaneously, creating a coordinated barrage that overwhelmed the Syndicate's automated defenses. Explosions bloomed across the moon's surface as energy weapons met their targets and shield generators overloaded. Lyra used her position as a fighter pilot to coordinate between the dragons and the human fleet. She relayed information about enemy positions, suggested targets for the human ships to focus on, and guided Storm and Ash toward the areas of heaviest resistance. It was dangerous work, and several times she felt the impact of enemy fire against her craft's shields. But the system worked. Within an hour, the Syndicate defenders had been forced to retreat into the deeper sections of the installation, abandoning their exterior positions. Margaret sent in human soldiers wearing pressure suits to secure the outer perimeter and begin the process of setting explosives throughout the complex. Lyra maintained air cover with Storm and Ash, watching for any signs of Syndicate reinforcements. Her heart was beating fast and her hands were tense on the controls of her fighter. She knew that if any enemy ships appeared before Margaret's team could complete their mission, everything would fall apart. Then Storm sent her an urgent message through their mental bond. The dragon had detected energy signatures moving toward them from a distant star system. More Syndicate ships were coming. They would arrive in minutes, maybe less. Lyra immediately transmitted this information to Margaret. The human captain was in the command center of her flagship, coordinating the extraction of her ground teams from the installation. Margaret did not hesitate. She gave the order to accelerate the timeline. The demolition teams would complete their work faster, and everyone would evacuate immediately. The explosives were set, and the human soldiers retreated to their ships. Margaret's fleet formed a defensive position around the installation, preparing to hold off the incoming Syndicate ships long enough for the demolition to be completed. Ash signaled Lyra that the enemy ships were very close now. She could see them on her sensors, multiple Syndicate vessels approaching at high speed. There were more of them than Lyra had expected, at least 8 ships, all heavily armed. Margaret gave the order to activate the explosives. The entire Syndicate installation shook as the carefully placed charges detonated in sequence. The enormous structure began to collapse, with entire sections falling into the moon's crust. Thousands of tons of supplies, weapons, and equipment were destroyed in massive explosions that lit up the moon's dark surface. The human ships accelerated away from the moon, moving at maximum speed away from the installation and toward the Syndicate ships. This was the moment when everything could still go wrong. The Syndicate ships were more numerous and more heavily armed than Margaret's fleet. If the humans tried to fight them in a prolonged engagement, they would lose. But that was not Margaret's plan. She had already calculated the optimal route of escape, using the gravity wells of the moon and the dead planet to increase her ship's speed without burning out their engines. She had positioned her vessels in a formation that would allow them to slip past the Syndicate ships before the enemy could close the distance. Lyra positioned herself and the dragons at the rear of the human formation, using their maneuverability to harass the Syndicate ships that were trying to pursue. Storm and Ash flew patterns that seemed almost impossible to a human observer, dodging enemy fire while remaining in perfect coordination with each other and with Lyra's fighter. The dragons began to acquire a reputation during that pursuit. The Syndicate pilots had never encountered creatures that could move with such speed and grace in space. They had never seen beings that could dodge energy weapon fire with near-perfect consistency. The psychological impact was significant. Several Syndicate ships reduced their pursuit velocity, unsure how to deal with enemies that did not behave according to their tactical models. Margaret's fleet jumped into hyperspace first, using the calculated coordinates that would carry them to a safe rendezvous point. Then Lyra activated her own jump drive, pulling Storm and Ash through the hyperspace portal at the last possible moment. The Syndicate ships tried to follow but arrived too late. The portal had closed, leaving them stranded in normal space. The Alliance had won its first real victory. When they regrouped at the rendezvous point, a hidden station orbiting a small asteroid deep in neutral space, everyone was exhausted but exhilarated. The supply depot had been completely destroyed. The Syndicate's supply lines in this sector had been disrupted. And most importantly, the humans and elves had proven that they could work together effectively in combat. Margaret called a joint meeting of her officers and Lyra's lieutenants. She presented the damage assessments and the tactical analysis of the engagement. By every measure, it had been a success. The Syndicate had suffered significant losses, and their defensive and offensive capabilities in this region had been weakened substantially. But more than that, the operation had demonstrated something important. It had shown that the Syndicate could be defeated. It had shown that they were not invincible. It had shown that humans and elves working together could accomplish things that neither species could achieve alone. Lyra stood and addressed the assembled group. She said that this was only the beginning. She said that the Syndicate would regroup and strike back. But now there were humans and elves ready to meet that challenge. Now there was hope that had been absent for far too long. She looked at Margaret and extended her hand in the human gesture of respect and alliance. Margaret took it, and for a moment the future seemed bright with possibility. Storm and Ash nuzzled against Lyra's shoulders, their scales vibrating with satisfaction. The dragons had proven themselves in combat, showing that they were not merely mythological creatures but genuine instruments of war and protection. The Syndicate would remember what they had encountered this day. In the following days, messages began to arrive from other human settlements and other elven colonies. They had heard about the destruction of the supply depot. They had heard about the partnership between humans and elves. Some were interested in joining the alliance. Others wanted to know if cooperation was truly possible. All of them were asking the same fundamental question that Lyra had asked months before. Could different species truly work together? Or was conflict inevitable? The answer Lyra now knew was yes. Different species could work together. They could trust each other. They could achieve great things when they had a common purpose and a shared commitment to each other's survival and success. 6 months had passed since the destruction of the supply depot, and the galaxy had changed in ways that few had predicted. The successful alliance between humans and elves had inspired other species to challenge the Syndicate's dominance. A coalition was forming, composed of multiple civilizations who had suffered under Syndicate oppression. But the Syndicate had also changed. They had adapted their strategies and increased their military presence in the region. They were no longer underestimating their enemies. They were no longer treating the conflict as a minor suppression operation. The Syndicate now viewed the Human-Elf Alliance as a genuine threat that needed to be eliminated with overwhelming force. Lyra stood in the command center of a new space station that had been built as a joint base for human and elf forces. The station hung in space above a planet that had been terraformed ages ago by an ancient civilization. Now it served as a gathering point for the growing coalition forces. The walls of the command center were lined with screens showing sensor data, ship positions, and tactical information. Catherine entered the command center with urgent news. The scouts had detected a massive Syndicate fleet assembling at a location 3 days away. This was not a raiding force or a punitive expedition. This was an invasion force designed to crush the coalition before it could grow any stronger. Lyra felt the familiar weight of leadership settle on her shoulders. She had made the decision to ally with the humans, and that decision had led to this moment. Everything that happened now would be determined by the choices she made in the coming days. She activated the communication system and requested a meeting with Margaret. The human captain arrived an hour later, accompanied by several of her senior officers. They studied the sensor data together, analyzing the composition and capabilities of the incoming Syndicate fleet. The numbers were not encouraging. The Syndicate fleet had more ships, more weapons, and more resources than the Human-Elf coalition could muster. But Margaret had learned something important during the previous months of cooperation with the elves. Numbers were not everything in warfare. Strategy, creativity, and willingness to take risks could often compensate for lack of sheer military power. Margaret proposed an unusual plan. She suggested that they not meet the Syndicate fleet in open space. Instead, they would draw the enemy into a region of space where the coalition would have certain advantages. They would use the terrain, the gravitational wells, and the obstacles that nature provided to offset the Syndicate's numerical superiority. Lyra studied the proposal and saw merit in it. She agreed to implement Margaret's strategy. Over the next 2 days, the coalition fleet was positioned in a carefully chosen location, surrounded by asteroids, nebulae, and regions of intense gravitational activity. It was a place where a larger fleet would be at a disadvantage because their ships would be unable to maneuver with the same freedom as smaller, more agile vessels. Storm and Ash were brought into the command center and positioned where they could survey the entire tactical situation. The dragons had become invaluable participants in the decision-making process. They saw things from a different perspective than humans or elves, and their insights often revealed strategies that others had missed. Lyra placed her hand on Storm's scaled head and felt the familiar connection of their bond. The dragon sensed the stakes involved in the coming battle. She sensed Lyra's determination and also her fear. Storm responded by projecting calm confidence back through the connection. The dragon believed in Lyra's ability to lead, and that belief gave the elf woman strength. When the Syndicate fleet emerged from hyperspace 3 days later, they found themselves facing an unexpected tactical situation. Instead of the coalition fleet arrayed in a simple defensive formation, they found themselves in a region of space that was extremely difficult to navigate and fight in effectively. Margaret's strategy became apparent immediately. The human ships moved through the asteroid field with precision that seemed almost impossible. They had trained extensively in this environment, learning exactly how to use the asteroids as cover while maintaining maximum firepower on their enemies. The elf fighters, led by Lyra, flanked the human formation, striking at the Syndicate ships that tried to break through. And above it all, Storm and Ash flew patterns that created confusion among the Syndicate pilots. The dragons did not need to cause massive damage. Their presence alone was enough to make Syndicate tactics unreliable. Enemy pilots could not predict where the dragons would appear next, and this uncertainty translated into hesitation and mistakes. The first hour of the battle was chaos. The Syndicate fleet suffered heavy losses as their larger ships became targets, while trying to maneuver in the narrow passages between asteroids. Several Syndicate commanders realized that they had been lured into a trap and attempted to withdraw, but Margaret had anticipated this reaction. She had positioned additional coalition ships to intercept any Syndicate vessels that tried to retreat. In the command center, Lyra monitored the battle through the sensor displays. She saw the moment when the Syndicate's coordination began to break down. She saw the point when the enemy command structure realized they were losing, and she made the decision that would define this victory. Lyra took her personal fighter out of the command center and flew directly toward the Syndicate flagship. Storm and Ash followed, their presence lending weight to the simple fact of a single elf woman challenging the entire might of the Syndicate hierarchy. It was a bold move, probably reckless, but it achieved exactly what Lyra intended. The Syndicate flagship attempted to concentrate its firepower on the elf fighter, trying to eliminate this symbol of resistance before she could cause too much damage. This concentration of fire left other Syndicate ships vulnerable to attack from the coalition forces. Within minutes, the Syndicate flagship had been struck by multiple coordinated attacks. Its shields failed and its weapon systems were disabled. Lyra performed a daring maneuver, flying directly past the enemy ship while releasing a package of electronic warfare devices that overloaded the vessel's communications and navigation systems. The Syndicate flagship fell into the asteroid field, its engines offline and its crew unable to coordinate a response. The Syndicate fleet commander, seeing their flagship disabled and realizing that they were losing the battle, gave the order for a general retreat. The coalition forces pursued the retreating Syndicate ships, inflicting additional damage but allowing them to escape. It would not have been strategically wise to push too hard. The important thing was that they had won. The Syndicate fleet had been defeated in a major engagement for the first time in decades. When Lyra returned to the command center, The entire facility erupted in celebration. Humans and elves embraced each other, jubilant that they had survived and prevailed. Margaret found Lyra and pulled her into an embrace, then held her at arm's length to look at her face. Margaret said that Lyra was the bravest person she had ever known. She said that the elf woman had changed everything, not just for her own people but for the entire galaxy. She said that this victory would ripple outward, inspiring other species to resist the Syndicate's tyranny. Lyra looked out at her people, the humans and elves who had worked together, fought together, and survived together. She thought about her mother and her father, about all those who had died before this alliance was possible. She thought about the 2,000 elves at the Prime Station, who could now live without constant fear of discovery and destruction. Storm and Ash pressed against her, their massive forms a comfort and a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. The dragons had played a crucial role in the victory, just as they always had. But more than that, they represented the possibility of partnership and trust between different species. That night, as Lyra looked out at the stars from the observation platform of the command station, she allowed herself to imagine a future where this was possible for everyone. A future where humans and elves worked together not just in war but in peace. A future where dragons flew the skies as guardians of freedom instead of weapons of conflict. It was a beautiful vision, and more importantly, it no longer seemed impossible. Margaret joined her at the observation platform, and the two women stood in silence watching the stars. The battle was over. The war was far from finished, but for the first time in generations there was genuine hope that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. The age of the hunted was truly over. The age where different species could work together to build something better had begun, and it had all started with one elf woman, 2 dragons, and the courage to believe that things could change.